All right, today we're going to talk about sanding and sanders, power sanders. And the first thing we're going to want to talk about when we talk about sanding or sanders is sandpaper, or the actual medium that we use to sand projects. When we're sanding, we're doing one of two things. One, we're either shaping the project, so if we got pretty close to the line, we can use a sander to bring it down to that line, or we're sanding down the surface to get it ready for finish work. Now, as part of some finishing processes, we are going to use sandpaper additionally on that, but that's usually going to be in the higher grits, the finer sandpaper, not the rougher stuff. So when it comes to sandpaper, sandpaper comes in different grits, and you can see here, 60 is probably the lowest that we're going to use in the shop, and 320 is generally the finest. We might use a finer sandpaper for some very specific application, but for the most part, we're going to use between 60 and 320, and there's a bunch of steps in between. Now, right here, I have a piece of 60, and if you get really close to it, you can see that this kind of has big pieces of aggregate stuck to it that make it very, very scratchy. This will change the shape of your wood fairly rapidly. It's going to remove a lot with each stroke that goes by on it. And then you can see that this is 320, and you can see it's much, much smoother. You can see it's not really digging into my fingers at all, and this is going to give you a nice flat surface over it. Now, when we talk about finishing later, we'll talk about how high we want to sand things. But generally, anything over 400, what it's going to do is it's going to take those pores of wood as they're opened up, and it will actually crush them over, and it's called burnishing. And it will give you a shiny surface, but you've crushed those pores, and when you do that, they can't accept any finish. So if you're looking for a finish that's going to soak into the wood and really hold on to it, sanding it too high is not quite going to do it. All right, so the first sander I want to talk about is a palm sander, and these are really, really common. We use them in the shop quite a bit for finishing flat surfaces. Sometimes we'll get an edge on it, but because it's got a nice flat surface to flat surface, you're really good, and you can get a nice job out of this. This has a cord that goes off to a power source. It's handheld. It also has a port right here that we generally plug our vacuum cleaner into, so we're going to have like a shop vac attached to this, so as it's creating dust, it's going to get sucked in and out, so you're not breathing it in. I'm always going to wear a respirator with this. I'm usually going to wear hearing protection and eye protection also when we're using these sanders, because the fine particulate matter is really, really bad for our lungs. Now you see it has a bunch of ports down here, these holes that run around it. And this is my sanding disc, and it has a whole bunch of holes. So when I get ready to put this on, these are Velcro, so it's got the soft fuzzy hook over here and the stickier hook over here. But when I get ready to put this on, I do need to make sure that those holes are lined up so it does vent properly. So there we go in, everything's lined up, so when it starts sucking through there, all that dust will be able to get collected up through there. All right, the other type of commonly used sanders that we're going to use is one is a disc sander, and the disc sander just has a nice big round disc of sanding aggregate that spins round and round. And the other one is an oscillating spindle sander, so it's more like a column of sandpaper that spins round and round, and it goes up and down at the same time. So a spindle sander is going to be used on inside curves. So if this is my piece of wood and I have a piece of cut that's kind of an inside arc like that, I'm going to use a spindle sander. If I have an outside curve like this, I'm going to go up against the disc sander like that, so I have a nice flat surface to work it on back and forth. So for inside curves, we want to use the spindle sander. For an outside curve, we're going to want to use the disc sander. Alright, so this is a disc sander. What the disc does is it rotates counterclockwise, and it's got a fairly abrasive surface on here. Now if you're using this and you notice that the disc is starting to come off, like it's not glued on there anymore, you gotta let me know, and I'll come in and I'll just replace it. To do that, you gotta take this plate off, peel it off, stick it on. That's usually a task that after I demo it the first time, I'll go and let students take care of. This bed does rotate up and down, so you can set it at different angles. You always want to check it for 90 when you go in here to use it. Now the tricky thing about using a disc is you can only use from this center point out to the edge on the downward motion side. So if it's rotating like this, this is the downward motion side. And never trust that they're all gonna run the same way. I've seen them set up in the opposite direction in some shops. It's really about how the electrician wired it in. This one does have an arrow that shows you that it's gonna point this way. So if you don't do that, you can actually have some pretty big consequences to it. I'll show you what happens. So if I'm over here and I'm on the downward motion side, I can sand and it's really not an issue. If I go over here, it picks up my workpiece. And it can actually send it all damn okay over here. And it can actually pick it up, send it over and slam it into the table. I've seen more than one project completely ruined when somebody came over, got into that edge and it took it over. Also, fingers can get pinched really easily. Now, one thing about this sander is you have, we call it a margin of error of 2 inches. So you don't want your fingers any closer than 2 inches to that sander. Unlike a cut that you would get on a saw or with a normal blade, this will grind off your skin and it's really, really painful for it to grow back. So just make sure you keep your fingers 2 inches away, and then in there's a gap, and the gap between, it's going to go right here in between the sanding disc and the table, and that needs to be no greater than 1/8 of an inch or things can get sucked into it. So this is used for shaping. Remember those outside curves. So if I wanted to put a radius on this, I could do it here. Or I could go to the saw, get rid of a lot of the material, and then just dress it up here. But before I do anything, I'm going to get on my protective gear. So I'm going to put my mask on. Hearing protection. And glasses. Then I'm going to get this going. And when I'm done, I took that squared off end and I turned it into a radiused edge. One pro tip for using this is if you come in and you bump in to get up to your line in a bunch of different spots, you'll have a faceted radius, where if you come in, you kind of smoothly run it back and forth, you'll get a much smoother radius because you don't have a bunch of flat lines that you're trying to turn into a circle or a semicircle. So just remember when you're working on this to smoothly go back and forth and get into your shape and try to stay on one side of the line because once you go over, there's no going back. Alright, so this is a spindle sander, and this is the spindle, and it goes round and round and up and down. It's hooked up to the whole class dust collection, which I have on right now, just in case we need to start using it. It's going to get rid of any sawdust. If you try and run this without the dust collection, it's just going to shoot sawdust all over the shop and make a giant, giant mess. So we have this table here and the spindle. Once the spindle's attached, you got to make sure when you tighten it down, if you're changing these out, that it is firm, but not overly tightened. We never want to overly tighten anything. It's not a feat of strength. So when I turn this on, I'll show you what happens. So it just goes round and round and up and down. And it does a really effective job of getting inside curves. So an inside curve is like this board, if I want to get this right here. Now when I'm picking my spindle for the job, I want the largest spindle that'll fit in this hole. So if I look at that, that's pretty big. That's about as close as I'm going to be able to get. So before I get started, I'm going to get my safety gear on, and then we'll go ahead and we'll sand this out. So I'm going to go respirator. headphones, glasses. So I went right up to my line and that is all sanded out. So it was a pretty quick and easy one. Sometimes we're trying to remove a lot more. Sanding is like our last ditch effort. We want to make sure we get as close to that line as we can on the machines before we get over here and get to sanding. Now one thing that's super important on this sander is it spins in a counterclockwise motion. So when you're sanding with it, you want to feed it into the spin. So if it's spinning this way, you want to go this way. You don't want to go with the spin. If you go with the spin, what'll happen is it'll grab your work and it can shoot away from you. So check this out. If I'm going with the spin and I bring it in there, it's going to take it and shoot it across the room.